China's innovation ecosystem has grown more advanced and sophisticated over the past decade, and navigating it has become increasingly difficult. To discuss this topic, please welcome our panelists. Kendra Schaefer, Director of Tech Policy Research at Trivium China. Jaap van Etten, co-founder and CEO of Datenna. Daniel H. Rosen, partner at the Rhodium Group. This conversation will be moderated by Anna Swanson of the New York Times.
I'll go ahead and get started here, if you can hear me. Can you hear me? No? Okay. All right, I'll just wait a minute here. You're not able to, are you able to hear me now? A little bit? Maybe better and better? Okay, great. All right. Hi, my name is Anna Swanson. I'm a reporter for the New York Times covering trade and China. I'm really delighted to be here with you today moderating this panel, which is about navigating China's innovation ecosystem. And in particular, we're going to talk about the US-China innovation competition, where each country is. I think this is a central question kind of underlying this whole gathering, and one that can be difficult for people to figure out the reality of, piercing sort of the lack of information about both countries, the propaganda efforts that are underway by governments, and just sort of the technical nature of the topics at hand. So I have a great panel here with me to discuss this. First, I have Jaap van Etten, the chief executive of Datenna, Kendra Schaefer, a partner at Trivium, and Dan Rosen, a partner at Rhodium Group. So I thought I would open it up with a lightning round and ask you the kind of yes or no question that I really hate to answer myself. But, you know, do you think the United States is losing the innovation ecosystem battle with China? And can we just, quickly kind of go down the line and throw out a couple sentences, your thoughts on this question, and then we'll dive in deeper. So, Jaap, would you like to start?
As experts, I dare to say we don't know.
All right, we'll dig into that.
I think China's probably winning on iteration speed, and the US is still winning on incentives.
I'll also offer a two-sided answer. China winning in terms of quantity of innovation being generated, but certainly not on quality. The United States still has an edge, which is in terrible peril right now of being squandered.
Okay, so you mentioned China winning on innovation speed, China winning on quantity, but other areas where the United States is in the lead. So let's dig into that a little bit. Tell me about, what do you think are kind of the advantages and disadvantages of China's industrial strategies, and where does the US still have an advantage? And maybe, Dan, we can start with you.
A lot of things can be said about that, but the thing I think I'd choose to focus on is that Beijing has the advantage of command and control, can compel the entire financial system to put a heavy emphasis on chosen areas of technology work. And this has been done, and in a number of areas, China has thereby closed the gap against what we consider to be the cutting edge generally in the United States. However, the disadvantage, it's come at the cost of national productivity, of dealing with social stability and welfare that has to be offset with repression, which is squeezing the creativity out of what China is capable of delivering. It's cost China its macroeconomic chops, which are highly debatable right now, and it has rung alarm bells all over the world, explaining what's happening under this roof the past 2 years in particular, and that's causing a balancing response. Unless the US terribly screws that up, the nature of things is going to be to contest what China's doing because of the way it's doing it.
Okay.
I'd agree with what Dan said, but on top of that, I think China has the advantage in terms of length of strategic thinking, right? China sets national strategy in terms of 20, 15, 5-year plans, and they don't need to deal with an election cycle every 4 years. And so there is a kind of handing of the baton off to each new leader over 5, 10, 15-year periods. And China, in a way that we have to struggle with, in a democracy. In a democracy with 4-year election cycles, of course, we have these wild flip-flops in strategy where one administration will be focused on one set of issues and the next administration will be focused on another set of issues. And of course, there's a ramp up at the beginning of every administration where, you know, there's kind of an adjustment period as everybody resets. And it's very difficult, of course, over a long period of time to set a pin in, all right, we're going to pursue AI development, for example, and here's how we're going to pursue that AI development, and then have the whole government ecosystem and have a whole of society effort and a whole of society consensus to follow along with that. Whereas China set a target in the early 2010s to pursue AI, and the methods by which they have chosen to pursue AI in that time haven't really changed that much in the intervening years. So that is one strategic advantage on that side.
Yeah.
To tag along on my answer for just now, where it's like, well, we don't know. By we, I mean the West. So how are we doing against China? And how does China's innovation ecosystem work? To the audience, this I think is the only panel focused on China of the whole Expo. So I hope you're China experts, but still, military civil fusion, MCF, is closely connected to China's innovation ecosystem. And they approach the innovation as a whole of nation approach. So each part, universities, academia, companies, military, all work in unison to build China into a national, global science and technology champion. Well, if they have a whole of nation approach, we, the West, should build a whole of nation monitoring system if we want to compare our system to theirs, and if we want to know if they are innovating more than we do.
Great. Dan, can you tell us a little bit about where you think China's innovation system is headed from here? And you basically argued that the Chinese system is kind of running out of money, right, from where it's headed now.
Yeah, and this kind of circles back to a second lap on comparative advantage and disadvantage here, because looking at, if we do this as sort of what explains China to date, just like any LLM, it's telling you about the past, what people thought the best answers in the past were. And pretty much everything that fueled China's progress the past 10 years absolutely cannot be done another 10-year lap around the track. They've gone from 100% of GDP debt ratios a decade ago to 300 or 350 today, depending on what numbers we want to look at. You can't take that to 600. Already at where they are today, whole industries and sectors are collapsing, and they're having all sorts of trouble convincing people that China is the right place to be investing. Scale, we didn't talk about scale yet, but one of the greatest intrinsic advantages China has is so much scale to work off of, and also that it was so under-provided for in the past. And so there was huge room to run to fill up the scale. China's population is now shrinking, as we know, but also the scale of domestic demand is too contingent on debt and on exporting to a world which is no longer willing to take it all. So their scale advantages are exhausted in some considerable extent and are going to go into reverse a bit. Now, none of that means that each of those things points to a clear competitive strategy the U.S. can take advantage of, but it certainly is a conversation to be had about what to do in these lanes where China no longer can make headway with the same playbook it's been using the past decade.
And when you're looking at the Chinese economy, what metrics are you most focused on when you're looking at whether the innovation ecosystem is running out of steam or how it's doing?
Yeah. Rhodium in particular are one of our, our preferred truthing lens is the credit data, which unlike a lot of other macroeconomic data in the system is pretty atomized. There's billions of points of information every day into small changes in demand for money. The People's Bank has been making a lot of new credit available to the technology sector. Very few private Chinese companies are willing to take on more debt and use that credit right now. And that says something about structural problems and anxieties around the use of additional credit and capital. So we look at credit data quite a lot. And then, of course, we also look at cross-border activity of all sorts because there's two sets of books when China trades with the world. Despite China's power in rare earths, in the vast majority of inputs that go through China's industrial economy, that's arising abroad. China's short on most things other than a handful of minerals. Of course, it processes for us all. But generally, you can say a lot about demand levels going into the Chinese system. And then, of course, we have imagery nowadays and other things that make up for the center's effort to suppress the kind of information we've long relied on.
Okay, great.
Maybe to connect to the answer that Dan gave. So when you see indeed the investments, they were driven from the government. So the government created funds of funds that invested, and again in local VCs. I think one of the key things that happened over the past years was that foreign investment firms, like from the US, were stopped from co-investing in China. That really decreased the amount of capital available to the investment firms. And this pushes now the Chinese government to become their own investor in their own companies, which is a lot more complex. Like we track 50 million companies and all the investment firms. And now you see that the state-owned enterprises are now being asked to chip in money that used to come from the US large VC firms. So you see a shift, and it's a lot more difficult for a government to run a VC firm than for a government to co-invest in a VC firm. So I think that's a big problem for the innovation system in China.
Yeah,
And there's actually also something of an interesting follow-on to what both of you were saying. I mean, essentially what you're saying is that China's going to have, as you said, a very difficult time recreating what it just created in terms of its growth cycle, right? And from what we're seeing, Beijing is well aware of that. And so AI is the solution that Beijing has started turning to as the answer to this problem, right? And the reason for that is that Beijing thinks of AI as a force multiplier in terms of economic growth. The population is shrinking, right? You don't have the same amount of resources that you had previously. So how do you do more with less? How do you more efficiently distribute all of the natural resources, all of the labor, all of the capital that you already have and that you can get access to? Well, they're kind of banking on something another researcher at Merrick's calls techno-solutionism. We're going to use AI as the solution to this problem. We're not 100% sure how that's going to work yet, but we really think that AI will help us distribute those resources and therefore make up for this population decline, make up for this slowdown with technology, which is one reason that AI is so critical to Chinese strategy.
Great, yeah, that's really fascinating. And Kendra, I'll stick with you when we talk about the role of the private sector, the role of public investment. I mean, DeepSeek is always a really interesting and topical example,
Sure.
obviously. So you've recently written about what DeepSeek tells us about China's AI innovation ecosystem. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so this is something very interesting that not many people are aware of because of China's AI regulation. China started regulating AI about 3 or 4 years ago. And obviously don't have time to get into all the details, but one of the rules of artificial intelligence in China is that if you write a generative AI tool, you have to register that tool with the state. And the state publishes that information. And so there's a list of every generative AI algorithm operating in China that the state itself releases. It's fascinating information. So what we did, including DeepSeek, of course, is on this list. Now, when I say generative AI tool, I don't just mean LLMs, although there are LLMs on that list, and there are 505 of them, quite a lot, right? DeepSeek's on there, but also much smaller tools, much less bleeding edge stuff, everything from selfie editors to e-commerce shopping chatbots, anything that uses generative technology, if the general public interacts with it, right, is kind of on that list. And so we collected all of that data, we processed it, we looked at what kind of sectors were seeing the most AI innovation in China. The question we were really trying to answer is, how many possible DeepSeeks are operating in China right now, right? DeepSeek really surprised us when it came out, and the answer is quite a few. I don't want to dominate the conversation here, but quite a few. No.
Great. Dan or Jaap, do you want to jump in on that? And I'm also really interested in this question of how effective you think U.S. export controls have been in holding back China's AI developments. I mean, it seems like that's a very controversial topic here between government officials and industry about how successful exactly that is.
I'll tag along on the on
Yeah.
the first DeepSeek.
Sure.
You're really right when it comes to the adoption of DeepSeek. I think in the past months we've seen a couple of dozens of DeepSeek tenders, not just to the military, but actually to generic government offices, hospitals where they're really keen on applying these technologies, probably to counteract the fact that in the future they need to have fewer people helping more sick people. So that's interesting to see. Then on the Expo control part, I think there's about 1,200 or so Chinese companies now on entity lists globally, 1,200. And as I mentioned before, we track 50 million Chinese companies and all their connections to all the military tenders and whatsoever. There's about, top of my head, I think 60,000 to 100,000 companies that are involved with military tenders. So they are supplying the Chinese military with technology, and they're not on an entity list. That number, 1,200 versus 100,000, that gap is way too large. And I'm not even talking then about downstream investments of those companies or the parent companies. So if you want to change export control, you have to change that system.
Interesting.
I mean, I would just observe that, since just the past less than a decade that we've started putting caveats on our assumption that maximum liberalism was in the American interest, we would win that game. I think it's fair to say that even the very imperfect effort at export controls that's been implemented here has had a profound impact on the direction and character of China's innovation journey. It hasn't stopped China from innovating, make no mistake about it. But where China would be today if there hadn't been a change of the wind here, and not just here, but in Europe as well. Remember Kuka and Eichstron and so many other European firms that were sold, NXP, in Han, et cetera. The trend that China was benefiting from has been reversed 180 degrees. Now they have a lot of critical mass of their own at home now, but they're really, prone to overstate how much they can do this alone. And I think as long as we don't end up in a kind of strategic nihilism in the West, in the United States, Japan, Korea, Europe, I still like the chances of the advanced market democracies to have a sufficiently superior innovation performance that we're not, doomed to parity with China in technology. Mm-hmm. So anyway, it's a slightly different layer, to look at in terms of this, but it's been incredibly effective. It hasn't at all resolved the strategic challenge. It's been done without paying a big enough economic cost. I mean, that's what's really slowing us from doing more, that we can do more to push back on China's strategic betterment, but it's going to come at a huge consumer welfare cost to us as a society. We're going to have to make choices and set priorities that are politically just very hard to make. So, yeah.
Kendra, data also plays a really important role in this, right? So how is China leveraging data for innovation? And do you think there's anything the United States could learn from that?
Yes, I definitely do. So it's often said that the three elements of AI competition are chips, talent, and data. And we're obviously competing with China on chips. We are sort of trying to compete with China on talent, although I don't think kicking all our Chinese scientists out of the United States is the best way to do that personally. But we're not competing with China on data at all. And I say that because we think we are, because we think that the competition that China's having, that the competition we're in is China's trying to steal our data and we're trying to prevent them from doing that, right? That's the race we're running. It's the wrong race, and it's not the race that China's running at all. What China's doing is trying to figure out how to activate the economic power of data domestically. Almost all of their data policy domestically is about creating a system where data can be squeezed for the most possible benefit, and that data is easily accessible to innovators domestically, right? And so what that actually means in reality is that there's a massive kind of whole of government effort to do things like write data privacy laws to make it clear what companies can and can't do with data so that they can go ahead and do the things they're allowed to do with data, right? To establish a data IP rights system, to this one's interesting and weird, but there's a push right now to enable local governments to make an economic profit on the data that they hold that is non-sensitive, so that governments that hold lots of data and control it are incentivized to push that data out to the market for innovators, right? So this really kind of whole of government effort to go, okay, how do we use this incredible resource that we generate so much of? And I'm not saying we need to copy China's strategy by any means. I'm not saying we need to manipulate the market to do this or that with data, or look at data the same way China looks at it. But this isn't even a conversation that's being had in the United States. I think that's probably an issue we
Kendra,
should address.
Can I ask you a question about that? Looking at the marketplace, a number of the parties' interventions were whole subsectors like education services was sort of kneecapped overnight.
Oh yeah.
That sort of makes it harder to value what data owned by companies is actually worth, because their ability to use that data to like compete in a normal way is a little bit doubtful,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Is that, how does that compare with the state's ability to grant consent decrees to use the data? How does it balance?
I mean, that's very interesting. And the state has flip-flopped dramatically on how it feels about A, tech companies, B, data, and C, AI and innovation over the last 3 years. What you're talking about is, a few years ago, I'm sure some people have read this in Bloomberg, the state decided that the private tutoring sector, for example, was now illegal and kind of kneecapped an entire industry. They shut down a lot of ed tech companies. These companies kind of disappeared. And now, interestingly, those companies are coming back as education AI firms. We actually saw in a lot of our research that what's actually happening is those companies who generated data, all that education data previously, didn't know what they were allowed to do with it, are now moving into the AI space and utilizing that data for AI. But I think the fundamental question that you're asking is, the private sector, the value of private sector data is great. The value of government data is great. If the government is the only one controlling the flow of data to private companies, I mean, is that essentially what you're getting at? Controlling the flow of data to private companies?
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, the state has realized its mistake, I think, in trying to clamp down on that. But Beijing has always been very comfortable, and in fact, I think they believe that it's optimal to hold two competing ideas in their head at the same time, right? One idea is promote innovation. The other idea is control information flows. Those two things are in radical opposition to each other, and yet the state tries to do both. So
Maybe a solution or part of the solution that we can do in the West, perhaps actually specifically what all these companies here can do and all the agency here. It's people like us. There's plenty of data companies here today. We all have pieces of information, public information, often that we build software for to collect that should be merged together, where we in a democratic commercial world, I think it's my vision that we work on a kind of like a OSINT standard where all the information that we collect become like standardized Lego pieces that people can put together so that analysts know where the OSINT is coming from, that they have data lineage and can build reports on it together so that also one agency uses a data piece of another agency, and then jointly, again, coming back to the whole of nation monitoring. If we want to know what's going on, it's not just one company, one research institute, like another company. It's needed joint effort that we should be focused on.
And I'll stay with you actually on this issue of, what of information and what supply chains look like. So, we are seeing this clash between the United States and China kind of morph from a clash over trade and tariffs into supply chain warfare, essentially. You've done a lot of work to map supply chains. Can you talk a bit about how dependent the countries are on each other for military and critical technology and where this might be headed given this current clash?
I think roughly 50% of me says we're going to enter into a uneasy coexistence phase for a long time, where we have to have the best visibility to know what they are good at, where we are supplying them with technology, and don't get me wrong, we're talking here today about innovation ecosystem, but we're maybe dancing around about real military applications. It's in the news that China is supplying laser systems to take down Ukrainian drones, whereas we were still surprised by their hypersonic missiles that could take down aircraft carriers. And then we're building laser systems now to actually do something about that. So we're caught by surprise. And I think that when we push more on China, the unease might flip into something else. It might be a melting pot around Ukraine. There's a Chinese company, they are collecting troop information on Ukrainian troop movements using OSINT. They're like the Chinese Datenna. At some point, the West will be too pissed off with this and feel like, okay, we're not going to take anymore. We're going to sever more ties. And then I think we'll flip from the unease into a more decoupling situation. Let's hope we can stay away from that. Because the uneasy part is already uneasy enough.
Mm-hmm. Where do you both think fall in that question? Do you think that the United States and China are headed toward more of a deepening split or some kind of reintegration as you look in your crystal ball with the Trump administration right now?
Yeah. I mean, the good news is only in areas that can be weaponized. The bad news is that's a bigger and bigger share of our economic activity. Mm-hmm. Things that were only recently thought of as fairly benign now have to be treated as at least somewhat concerning. So the surface area for mischief is just getting wider and wider. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, without some technological basis of trust, there's going to need to be more and more of a sort of precautionary principle of not allowing, not permitting a sort of normal exposure to those kinds of vulnerabilities. And so I think that the predominant trend is going to be de-risking, at least for some considerable period of time. And, to a great extent, whole industries are going to need to be decoupled. It would be further along already if that wasn't a many trillions of dollar proposition. So we're going to be rebuilding things that already exist perfectly well, plenty of capacity in the world to produce them, and yet we're not going to be comfortable relying on them. So we're going to have to rebuild all of that, which means taking resources away from something else. And it's time for politicians and national security folks to be honest about that price tag and stop treating it as though it could be painless in any way, shape, or form.
Wow.
I'm going to answer that. He did so well answering that from the geopolitical and trade perspective. I'm going to answer it from a very different perspective, which isn't the one you actually asked about. But I do think we're headed towards a decoupling on foundational technology, on our foundational technologies. And I say that because China is building a very different tech ecosystem than the one that exists in the US, particularly on the internet. I started my career out as a developer many years ago and took a very weird path to Chinese tech policy research. But I lived in China for 20 years. I was a developer. I still run a lot of our development teams. And because of the Great Firewall, because of a separate ecosystem of social media and social networks, because of a separate ecosystem now, we're looking at AI and chips, right? There's this kind of geopolitical trend towards pushing the two countries apart. What's actually happening is that the code bases, the code libraries, the method of development, the ecosystem of technologies that are used to build, right, platforms that people use are starting to do this. And it used to be that you could hire a coder from anywhere. It wouldn't matter where they were. Code's a universal language, and you could pick them up and hire them and have them build your platform anywhere you wanted. Well, now we can't really hire coders from China anymore as much as we would love to, because they build a different way, right? This divergence is early days. But I think some of these, what's interesting is we haven't really imagined this world yet, a world in which there are techno blocks, right? I'm not talking geopolitically, but here is how the business norms, the technical norms, the libraries work here, right, for our ecosystem, and here's the technical norms in the libraries, and here's how they work here. I think that will necessarily have to accelerate.
And I'll just throw this open to any of you, but Kendra, you did mention talent earlier. I wonder what you all think about the role of kind of exchanges of people and human resources at this point. So, you know, it seems like this exchange of people is a national security risk, but it's also a source of national security strength when you think of, you know, who is powering a lot of America's labs, a lot of times, you know, Chinese citizens or Chinese immigrants. You know, where do you think the United States should draw the line when it comes to people? The Trump administration, of course, right now looking at visa restrictions, targeting U.S. universities, so a big topic right now.
Man, oh man. I mean, step one is to preserve our own science and education culture in this country and not fritter it away needlessly and purposelessly for political purposes. And then see how much more we need. How many, like, is it 2x or 10x more people than we're producing ourselves? If we're going to have scale enough to be competitive here, it's going to be scale in human resources and talent. And for the time being, that means knowing how to involve foreign nationals, including Chinese nationals, in the American innovation deepening. And I think for some time to come anyway, there's going to be a net benefit to us of doing the hard work of navigating that, dealing with the quite real security concerns and considerations, rather than just sort of fecklessly pulling the plug on it all and saying, we'll just do this ourselves, which we can't do. We know that much.
We're working a lot with academic screening officers, and we try to stay away as much as possible from the people perspective. What we're advocating is that if you're a Western university or a Western company, you're working together with a Chinese university, use software to figure out if the technology that you're going to work on with that university, if the Chinese university is supplying the Chinese military with that technology. Because if that's the case, then you're helping the Chinese military to grow. So instead of taking the focus on people, have a matrix focused on technology times military application. If you prevent that, then I think you've already covered 90% of the problem, and then you can keep your highly valued data scientists, AI engineers here. Oh, I didn't know, by the way, that you're also a software engineer.
Yeah.
That's great to know.
I haven't, back when that was really easy. That used to be easy. Now you need to know like giant frameworks. I haven't done that in a while. But yeah, I used to be a software engineer. Yes.
So definitely a role for more information, right? More detailed information. So the United States could be more targeted rather than have this kind of bigger.
That's at least my advice to them, yes.
Okay, all right. Well, I want to kind of sum up by asking you more if there's anything that makes you feel optimistic about, you know, the United States when it comes to innovation. We've talked a lot about China's advantages. Are there areas in which you think the United States has an advantage as well?
I mean, macroeconomically, there's so much that should cause somebody to go long United States before one goes long China right now. China has had the best 40, 50-year run of any country in human history, and that is really, you know, something to be appreciated greatly. However, that has come with some limits now that are going to present a pretty tough decade to China in many ways, whereas the United States has a lot of potential to do very, very well macroeconomically here. And that can crowd in a tremendous amount of global effort. And I don't think that's adequately appreciated how important it is to protect the institutions and fundamentals that make that dynamism happen in the U.S. despite all of our mistakes over the years. And then at a much more micro level, final thought for me here on this, these AI tools, provided that we believe it when we say that at the end of the day it's about the humans, it's not about letting the robots off the leash and letting them fight it out and we'll just go to the beach, right? They're tools that people can be empowered with to be more competitive and more effective. And the notion that Beijing is going to devolve decision-making and power using the potential of AI to let provinces, individuals, companies compete better is still extremely difficult to believe if you understand the control fetish that the Communist Party of China has. We don't have that problem. We're willing to let things off the leash and let companies do it, individuals do it, even I used to think states do it and municipalities do it. So there's a real advantage there for the US if we preserve it and if China doesn't do what it needs to do and move past this party's got to control everything thinking, let these tools do their magic.
That's fascinating. Yeah.
I'd say, China's really struggles with open-ended research. They've struggled with it for years and years and years and years and years, right? Funding a group of researchers that can just go without any required output necessarily, right? Without any result required. And China has tried and tried and tried and tried to set up a funding mechanism that allows for this, and yet the incentive system domestically really does not, right? Somebody's KPI is always to have a result that is commercializable, right? That is applicable, that is. And so we do so well at this. We do so well at giving rein and funding just open-ended research. I think that's really where our strengths are. I think it's critical that we don't defund the programs and government institutions that are the major funders of that research and the major supporters of that advantage.
I'll keep it brief. I think China, and it's been said by someone probably a lot smarter than me, but China has customers, and the West, we have allies. And yes, there might be a rough patch here and there, but that happens. It's events like this where we share information, where we network with each other. We walk to each other's booths to learn what we do and see what's the best in all of us, and be on a shared mission together as one united West. I think that's our power.
Great. All right, well, we're about out of time for today, so thank you so much to our panelists for a very interesting discussion.